the climate that we're in with all the racial injustice that has been brought to light. We can certainly have this discussion about the current systems that are still in place to enslave and restrict Black Americans' freedoms. So today we will be talking about those current systems. So a little bit about myself. I use she, her pronouns. I'm an undergraduate at WashU University. I'm a history major and a Chinese minor. And I am on the Student Union Senate Leadership Board as our Diversity and Inclusion Committee Chair. So with that, I would like to introduce you to Demar Lewis and Brighid Dwyer, who are also two very amazing individuals who will also be talking about their experiences and their thoughts on these issues. So Demar, if you want to go first, and then Brighid next.
Sure. Thank you, Nkemjika, for that and the introduction. My name's Demar Lewis. I use he, him, his pronouns. Currently, I'm a Ph.D. candidate in sociology and African American studies at Yale University. Originally born in Los Angeles and grew up in Denver, Colorado. I see I've got family on here, so I had to give a shout out to them too. And yeah, I think, you know, I could talk about various experiences that I have, but I think what I'll say is that prior to starting my PhD, you know, I have various experiences spanning different sectors. So have worked in corporate finance, I've worked in consulting, worked in public health focused nonprofits and then local government. And, you know, also as a student, I've had various experiences when I was a master's student at the University of Michigan in the Ford School of Public Policy, as well as a doctoral student. And so I say all that is to say that, you know, I bring those experiences to light in the things that I do research on. And broadly, my work thinks about the health consequences of policing, incarceration, and historical racial violence, with a particular focus on lynching in the United States. And I could say a lot more, and probably, hopefully we'll get more into that in the conversation, but just very grateful to be here. Thank you.
Great. And good afternoon, everyone. I'm Brighid Dwyer, a she, her pronouns. I am Associate Dean of Diversity and Inclusion at Princeton University. And I first echo Demar, it is a thrill to be here. Mark and Nkemjika, thank you so much for the invitation and your willingness to engage and facilitate this conversation. It's really, really timely. And so I'm really thankful to be a part of this and really to engage with all of you. Can't wait to hear your questions and hear how you all have been thinking about Juneteenth as a day and just the historical moment, the present historical moment that we are in. So much is going on. I feel like I'm drinking from a media fire hose. My email is a fire hose. So there's just so much to talk about. There's so much going on right now. And so I'm really thankful for you all making the time to be here to talk about this important conversation. A little bit more about me. I guess this is the California themed panel. So I'm also from California. I'm originally from Oakland, California. And then I went to UCLA and spent some time in the Midwest before heading east and being at a couple of different institutions out on the East Coast. So yeah, I think similarly to Demar, my upbringing and who I am is really formed by my experiences growing up in the Bay Area and really thinking about and engaging with people from a lot of different backgrounds and learning from them and learning about different historical pieces from different communities and just engaging in a lot of different difficult conversations, I think, throughout my life. So I identify as a biracial woman and a light-skinned woman, and I think as we're talking about race, it's important to acknowledge that. And so I recognize that I come from a place of privilege, having fairer skin, and I recognize I can't necessarily know the experiences of family, coworkers, friends who have darker skin, and that they may be targeted or have different sets of experiences compared to me. So as we're talking about race, I just think it's really important to name both the different identities and the different experiences people have, particularly within this moment as we're talking about race and Black America. So the other piece that I'll add is I also had a previous career in athletics, and so I think there's some interesting intersections that may or may not come up today, but over the last week in my own work at Princeton, I've been engaging a lot with athletics about, how athletics can be a platform. I think that, we've had some conversations even with prominent coaches in the NBA actually this week, and about how they use their platform and how players and coaches both use their platform as a way to get the message out. And so I think it's important that as we continue this conversation, that we think about what platform we all have and how we can utilize our platform in whatever way it is to continue conversation and to engage people. So thanks.
Thank you for sharing those thoughts and also addressing the importance of intersectionality. Obviously, colorism, misogynoir is another topic we can address. There's so many topics that we can address and so many intersectionalities when speaking of this issue. So thank you for addressing that. So essentially how this town hall is going to work is I'm going to ask a couple of questions to both our panelists, and then there will be a time afterwards for a Q&A from all of you guys to ask questions, share some personal thoughts. And then after that, we will have people stick around to have a dialogue with the panelists. So if anyone who wants to stay on Zoom, please feel free to do so. You will just need to have your video on during that dialogue. So the first question I'll start off with is this moment in our history and the issues that inform the Black experience seem to be framed and politicized in order to meet the comfortability of the individual. So how are you personally processing this moment, and how and why are your conversations about this moment, your descriptions of the experiences and your response different depending on who you are talking to? Anyone feel free to jump in.
You can go first this time, Brighid.
All right, thanks, Demar. You know, as I mentioned, I feel like I'm really drinking from this media fire hose, and how I'm doing and what I'm processing and experiencing is changing so much day to day. And so, you know, I've really found, I've also remember I was looking at this was a number of weeks back, maybe even a little more than a month or so ago. I remember somebody posting on social media Maslow's hierarchy of needs. And you know, they have at the bottom, you picture that pyramid. At the bottom, it's talking about your basic human needs. So you need to be fed, to have shelter, feel safe and protected. And then at the top of that pyramid, it says, you know, pieces where you're creative, you have innovation, and you're having all these new ideas. And this image of that had an arrow to the bottom, and it said, "We are here. We are not up here," in terms of thinking about this place of creativity. And for me, I think that was incredibly helpful because it was really captured where I currently am. I feel like with COVID-19, I'm a person who's had some chronic health issues. I'm a person who's of Black descent. I'm a member of a number of these different groups that are extremely vulnerable within the COVID-19 pandemic. And so I think especially early on when our university went home and we had all these stay-at-home orders, I was really scared, right? And I found myself in this moment of really just trying to meet my basic needs, right? Just really trying to care for myself, care for my family, and care for my needs. And as you know, the months and weeks went on, and we continued to see the continued lynching of Black people, that sense of really being at that bottom of the pyramid was really reinforced for me. So, you know, I've been really finding it challenging. I think I'm getting there. Day by day, I'm getting there. I feel like I'm able to find my voice a little bit more. I'm able to find my own words. But I'm finding it really challenging to be creative and to be in a space where I'm trying to, you know, think about facilitating for other people and really trying to create some meaningful statements. So I'm challenged, you know, right now I'm really kind of challenged. But I have found some inspiration from other people's words. You know, I think that there was a powerful statement that Robert Sellers put out from University of Michigan a while back that was circulated. I see a couple people nodding, and so other people, you know, have read that. I'm actually going to read a piece of that in a moment. But then also, you know, thinking about you know, other folks that the Reverend Al Sharpton and talking at George Floyd's memorial or funeral. That was powerful. You know, there's been some really powerful moments and some really powerful phrases and things that people have expressed that have been very helpful for me when I've been struggling to find my own voice and find my own words. And so I'm just going to read this because I think for me, what Dr. Sellers wrote really captured, I think, where I was as a lot of the movement around Black lives was galvanizing. And so just one more bit about me. So I said earlier, I identify as a biracial woman. I am married to a Black man. I have, you know, 2 Black boys. They are fair skinned, but I have 2 Black boys. I have a whole set of in-laws that are Black men, right? So this while I feel I recognize the privilege that I have in this light skin, I also have a lot of fear around people that I'm, that are my family, when it comes to thinking about the continual lynchings. So Rob Sellers, who also identifies as a Black man and is a professor of psychology and the vice provost for equity and inclusion at the University of Michigan, wrote, "This morning I woke up very tired, not your normal tired. I woke up with a kind of tired that can only be found on the other side of loss, anger, frustration, sadness, and despair. This morning, I woke up in a state in which African Americans make up roughly 13% of the population, but comprise 31% of the people with COVID-19 and 40% of the people dying from COVID-19. I woke up in a country where a white woman can not only accuse an African American man of threatening her because he is simply asking her to obey the law in a public space, but she can actually weaponize the police for her own aims simply by repeatedly referring to him as being African American. The scary truth of the matter is not that she believed or even hoped that she would get a different response by evoking race when making her 911 call. The really scary thing is that she was right. By evoking race and Blackness specifically, she placed a target on his back, putting a man's life in real danger. The recent murders of George Floyd and Ahmaud Arbery make this point abundantly clear. By being a Black male interacting with law enforcement can be hazardous to one's health." And he goes on to say more and closes his letter by saying, this morning I woke up bone weary tired. So for me, Rob Sellers just really captures a lot of the essence of what is at the heart of, for me, what's going on when I'm thinking about, Juneteenth, are we there yet? Have we been emancipated? Are we at a place where we can celebrate? There's a lot to be thankful for. There's a lot of progress that has happened, but there's also a lot of work to do. So Demar, I'll toss it to you.
Sure. No, thank you for getting us started. I had to update some of my talking points because I think there's a lot of important context that you hit on, and I think for me, I'm processing this moment in a lot of different ways. Emotionally, physically, intellectually. And I think, for quite honestly, it's sometimes challenging to separate how I'm processing this moment from one another. And, one way to say that is that, in speaking about George Floyd, the murder of George Floyd, I went to college at the University of St. Thomas, which is about a mile away from where he was killed. The grocery stores that were getting, ultimately that were burned down or where people were protesting, like those are the places that I frequented, right? And so I think, the pain I've been experiencing is also, attached to the pain that I know many of my friends and community in Minnesota are experiencing. Which has been hard to kind of deal with from afar in Connecticut. One of the questions that I find myself asking right now is, who will be next? And this is a double entendre that, I'm shamelessly borrowing from the work of the Office for Academic and Multicultural Initiatives at the University of Michigan. And it means two things. One of these meanings quite literally applies to police violence, state violence, and death being imminent threats for Black people in America and for communities across the world. And the other is a call to action. And it speaks to some of what Brighid was touching on in her opening comments. It was, who will be next to take up the mantle of leadership and justice to create change in the world? Who's going to step up and mobilize their resources to fight back against the systemic racism, sexism, transphobia, and xenophobia that is literally destroying communities across America or in our country writ large? And part of what I'm seeing happening right now is an outcry from communities for abolition democracy. And this is something that, it's a term that was coined by W.B. Du Bois, and it's something that Dr. Angela Davis talks about in her work, which describes, the establishment of institutions that don't perpetuate systemic racism or other forms of oppression for their survival. People are acknowledging that their rights of citizenship were not and have not fully been realized by the passing of major legislation in the United States. And, another way that this is kind of affecting me in this moment is, for the dissertation work that I plan to do and that I'm going to do, where, I do work on policing, but in particular, in the moment we're living in, police accountability is a major issue. And so one of the things that I am hoping to explore in my dissertation is how, Black people who are living in a large Midwestern city that has already witnessed major structural police reform, or is alleged to have done so, how do they imagine the future of the institution of policing and the reformist or abolitionist interventions that might help us build that future, right? So how do we take seriously what different communities are saying when they're saying, we want to defund the police, or how we want to dismantle the police, right? And how do we also get the perspectives of people who've already seen this happen about, is this the right way to go? Or do we need to look in a different direction, or think of alternative measures to achieve the outcomes that we want to achieve? And I think in thinking about, the theme of today's panel, and thinking about, Juneteenth and the significance of that, one of the things that was touched on in opening remarks was that the Emancipation Proclamation didn't free all Black people from slavery. Moreover, the 13th Amendment institutionalizes and normalizes slavery through the practice of incarceration, right? The Civil Rights Acts of 1964, 68, and affirmative action, among other drastic policy measures, haven't eradicated racial discrimination in employment, housing, education, or voting. We're still fighting to eliminate those forms of discrimination and colonialism from our society, because different individual and institutional actors have found creative ways to re-entrench and re-normalize those practices using various scripts. And in my work, I try to pay a lot of attention to scripts, because oftentimes they're used to criminalize certain populations, to advance the political objectives of others, right? And so if we think about things like the war on crime, or the war on drugs, and the war on terror, like maintaining those wars has allowed us as a country to maintain our allegiance to the institution of policing, as well as the institutions that police, right? Despite the fact that we know that those measures and those agendas are largely ineffective at achieving their stated mandates. And so, I say all that to say is, like, I'm having a lot of different reactions. And so, depending on who I'm talking to, I'm having very different conversations with different people. So some people I'm in conversation with, or not in conversation with, are remaining intentionally ignorant as to what's happening in the world, and aren't willing to reimagine how we can change the status quo, or aren't willing to see how we can even entertain, people's calls for that in the world. But there are other people who I'm in conversation with who do agree that change needs to come, but don't necessarily know exactly how we get there, right? And, I think that that's important, because, in order to get places we've never been, we have to be willing to do things we've never done. And that is hard, right? But that's kind of what the times are calling for. And, that's what COVID-19, being in the midst of this pandemic, that's what that's calling for. How do we address a major global public health crisis that we never knew was coming? We can't just do the same things we've been doing over and over again. We have to figure out, how do we come up with creative ways to address those solutions? And so I think, we're dealing with multiple pandemics that are overlapping at the same time. And so, I find myself having, again, different reactions, but also finding optimism in the spaces where I'm able to be in community and have conversations with others about what we're facing.
Thank you, Demar and Brighid, for sharing those thoughts. Demar, I really like that you brought up the point of scripts, right? Like this idea that, like, sometimes things don't really change. You just have to reward them a little bit so that people are comfortable with what's happening. So, for example, and I think a really good one, again, that you brought up was the 13th Amendment, and how slavery was essentially criminalized and institutionalized, making it so that, Black individuals could be criminalized and enslaved, but it would still be legal under the law, and it would be comfortable for particularly white Americans, because, that's just the way the law was, and you weren't supposed to argue with the law. So I think that's just another thing to keep in mind when you're thinking about slavery. And I think also just the conversations we're having today, if you're having a conversation that seems a bit too comfortable, maybe it's not the conversation you should be having, or maybe it's not the conversation that's going to bring about change. So my next question that kind of ties along with that is that our universities, our education, our laws, you know, even our language have a way of understanding each other, and again, have been scripted by whiteness and colonized frameworks. What is the path for the Black community in a system that is founded and designed on racism? And before you guys jump into that, I just think this question is really important because, you know, going to a predominantly white institution, both for college, but also in high school, I went to a predominantly white boarding school in New England. So these are conversations we're constantly having. You know, how do you get the education you want and move up in the world when it seems that these institutions weren't really built for you and this language wasn't really built for you? These laws aren't built for you. You know, how can you reform that, revolutionize that in many ways? And I think it's a lot of conversations I'm having with my peers right now, especially at WashU. I'm also in a sorority, so those are conversations we're having within our chapter of what that means to be in a, you know, an organization or a school that wasn't made for you. So if you guys could talk about that. Either one.
Yeah, Demar, why don't you take this one first? We'll alternate who leads off. So go ahead.
That's a good idea.
All right. No, that's fine. This is a really important question, and I think there's no one specific answer. And so, you know, for folks who find themselves potentially frustrated by what I'm about to say, I'm happy to talk more about this and to unpack what I'm going to say. But I'm going to try to speak from the principles that I believe in, that where I stand. And so, you know, I believe that Black people should be given the autonomy and resources that will enable us to pursue our own collective self-determination. And if you look at history, the United States has never given Black people or Black communities unimpeded opportunities for citizenship and self-determination that weren't otherwise undermined by resistance from people who wanted to preserve the political objectives and interests of white supremacy. We have to name that. That has to be acknowledged. And, you know, for people who are looking for references or things to read, there's an excellent article by a legal scholar, critical race scholar, Cheryl Harris, called Whiteness as Property, in which she kind of unpacks these issues in ways that are very important for us to understand and for folks to look at. And, you know, I also believe that, you know, the way forward depends on the goals that we as a country or we as different coalitions within communities are trying to achieve. You know, but ultimately, I think that, you know, we have to be willing to experiment. You know, if we want to create healthy communities that thrive off of equitable access to resources and important social determinants of health, we have to figure out how do we develop interventions capable of achieving those goals that are not only mindful of historical inequities, but also mindful of the failures of historical reform efforts. And, you know, likewise, in kind of bringing this forward to contemporary conversations about defunding and dismantling the police, I would also make two arguments, one of which is we need to not only defund or consider what it would look like to defund or dismantle the police, but also, again, to defund and dismantle the facets of institutions that police, right? The police are a part of a larger ecosystem of actors that have conflicting and sometimes overlapping goals. So to some extent, we have to take a step back as a country and thoroughly evaluate how the logics of surveillance and criminality are woven into the very institutions that many of us work in, many of us live in, many of us have ties and attachments to. And, you know, this is, I'm in making this call, I'm paraphrasing, you know, a lot of work that's great work that's being done in public scholarship by different emerging scholars, some of which include friends and colleagues, Brittany Battle, Philip McHarris, Bridget Davis, Kalisha DeSuze, and Amber Hamilton, to name a few. But I also think it's important to say that, you know, we're not alone in that. We're standing on the backs and the work of a lot of scholars and community organizers who, you know, we're also shoulder to shoulder with in this fight. But I also think, you know, the thing about dismantling and defunding and dismantling the police that we also have to talk about is that we can't, in pursuing different reforms, whether we pursue total abolishment or we pursue structural reform, we have to look at what are we actively doing outside of the institution of policing specifically? It can't just be about how do we change the police to make them better, to regulate them more, this or that. We have to take the approach of thinking about the ecosystem, right? Because what happens and has happened a lot with historical reforms is that, you know, we put something on paper that's effectively a contract, you know, where, you know, people will work towards the contract. But, you know, if we're not simultaneously holding people accountable for, you know, their excessive use of force and poor educational outcomes in, you know, historically marginalized communities where that don't have access to equitable education resources, that's problematic. Or if we're saying, you know, we want to, you know, stop deploying officers unnecessarily, we can't also criminalize poverty and, you know, push people out of their homes in places of business at the same time, because that's going to contradict how we're going to be able to get to our goal. And so there's a lot more I could say about that, but I think I'll.
Yeah, I think this is such an important question, and really, you know, thinking about, you know, these cultural scripts is really important, because, you know, I think that there's so many coded ways in which we talk about race and racism. You know, as I've been working with various groups, you know, both not just at my own institution, but at other institutions, there's been a lot of people who are afraid to name race, right? And so I think that people of color are often much more comfortable saying Black, saying, you know, saying white, saying, you know, multiracial, saying Asian, right? Like, we name it. It's not, to me, it's not that hard. I've been doing it for a long time, but it's really uncomfortable for some white people. You know, there's a lot of people who are saying, oh, you know, the things that are going on. Someone, a colleague of mine even said that someone that they know said, you know, the non-COVID issue that is happening. I'm like, what do you mean the non-COVID issue? There are so many things that are happening. And we have to be able to name and clearly say what is happening. If we're trying to solve a problem, or if we're trying to solve it, you know, come up to a point in the solution, if we can even name and specifically say what's going on, that's a big problem, right? So, you know, I specifically use the term lynching. These are lynchings that are happening. These are not like a death. It's not violence that's happening towards the Black community. These are murders and lynchings that are happening. And until we're able to name and talk about what it means to have a lynchings in 2020, that's not something that happened in, you know, the 1800s. No, it's something that happens today. That changes the conversation. And so we have to be able to have the courage to call something what it is. And until we can name it, we can't change it. If we're saying, oh, the thing that's happening, there's a lot, what, the thing that I have to go make dinner? No, that's not what we're talking about. We are talking specifically about killings, about lynchings. And that's a very different kind of intensity it brings to the conversation. And so, you know, that I think for me is one of the biggest things that has been critically important as we're talking about scripts and as we're talking about the language that we're using. And so I try to be really, really intentional about that, because I think that the ways in which we begin our conversations sets up how they're going to go from there. If we start off a conversation, if we start off an action, if we start off a policy being very vague about it, it's really hard to kind of come back from that vagueness. We have to be very deliberate, very explicit in naming what's going on in order to solve that problem. So I think for me, that's something that's really, really critically important. And, you know, I think I was introduced to Dog Whistle Politics a number of years back. And for me, that was a text that I think was just it's also a legal, produced by a legal scholar, but it's just so poignant in the way that Lopez just talks about, you know, dog whistles, these coded ways in which we use language to not say, but say what we're trying to meet, you know. So I've been looking at a lot of both new and old footage from things that are happening, and, you know, seeing how, you know, there's people who are commentating on the news, talking about a pull-up, you know, somebody who's been pulled over, a Black man who's been pulled over, and they're like, oh, you know, that looks like a bad guy. So how can you tell it looks like a bad guy? That is a Black man. That's the only defining factor that you have. But we're using this coded language. Oh, he looks like a bad guy. No, he looks Black. That's actually how he looks. But it produces a very different result, right? And so I think that the same thing, you know, Mark Lamont Hill also put out something a couple of weeks ago on Brio, where he talks about the difference between riots and rebellions, right? And so he's really calling that these are not riots, he's really challenging us to talk about these as rebellions, to say this is a systematic way in which people have been, Black communities have been disenfranchised, have had lots of resources taken away from them. And so when you rebel, a riot gives the impression that something is, it is haphazard, it is unplanned, it's very, it's chaotic, people are just acting on their gut. A rebellion is much more systematic. It's much more a reasonable response to continual acts of terror and violence that happened against Black people for generations. And so to reframe the conversation by saying rebellion as opposed to riot, it provides a different way that we can solve an issue. And so in the same way that, Demar was really talking about, this way forward, I think we really have to be creative. It's both the, you were saying, whether we defund, whether we, completely kind of tear down and rebuild, or we reform within, a lot of the way that we are going to decide and a lot of the way in which we are going to go about that change is going to be dependent on how we're able to define the issue, right? So people say the definition of insanity or crazy, which, I try not to use those words too much, but is doing the same thing over and over again. And so we're trying to, right now, as we're trying to figure out how to move forward, we are doing the same thing over and over again. I mean, the carbon copy of the I can't breathe is just, do we need a bigger wake-up call? We're trying to solve the same issue that has been happening time and time again. And so we need to start, I think one way in which we can start to get to a different solution, so we're not having this conversation again next year and 2 years from now, is how do we change how we're talking about things? That's at least a beginning. If we change the way we're naming what is happening, it can start us thinking about solutions differently. If we continue to frame things in the same way, we have the courage to really name what's going on, it provides an opportunity for us to think about creative solutions in ways we hadn't originally planned. So that's I guess how I'm thinking about that question.
Thank you for that. So as you can see, Callista put it in the chat that if you have any questions for our panelists, we've now moved into the Q&A portion. So you can either type them in the chat or you can use the raise hand function. And oh, just kidding, we have a question already, but you can use the raise hand function if you don't want to type it in the chat, and you can speak your question. I will say that if you do intend to say your question, make sure that your video is on so we can see an actual face. But first question is from, or I guess it's not a question. Okay, so first question from Karis Johnson. Sorry if I said that wrong, but what suggestions do you have for how these changes can be implemented into the education system, specifically in higher education?
Yeah, so I'll start off and then Demar jump in. This is tough. I think we need to give the same kind of scrutiny to our higher ed system as we are to policing and to all kinds of other institutions. And it's tough because many of us on this call are members of higher education institutions. And so it's hard to critique the institution that is supporting us, is paying us, that is helping to provide our liveliness. But part of how I see my own job is to make the institution better, is to make sure that the most vulnerable at the institution, students, faculty, staff, do not have detrimental experiences. And so, I think the key is to try to critique very carefully. And maybe provide suggestions. Critique might even be too strong a word, depending on where you are. But think about, I think it just goes back to this idea of thinking outside of the box. So we have to start thinking about things differently. And so, I think whether it is, starting conversations by using different language. Again, I don't know exactly what area of higher education that the person who asked the question specifically works in. But I think that there can be specific ways in which we can frame questions that bring up a lot of these questions. So I think there's ways we can say, well, what if we imagine? Let's just forget the reality for a moment. What if we imagine this? Or what do I need to believe about somebody else's perspective that would help me understand why that decision was made? So I might, maybe there's a new policy that comes out that I don't agree with, or somebody, decides to, say something in the meeting and where I'm like, that's really, I don't know that rubs me the right way. Now I try to sit back and ask myself, what is it about that person's experience that's so different from mine, where that would be their natural reaction, because my reaction might be entirely different. And so for me, that helps me to see the humanity in that person. And then it helps me think about how we can work together to create a solution. Because sometimes there are these gatekeepers, right? We need to go through, you know, different offices, different people, to get to where we need to go. And it can be challenging if we're not seeing the issues as the same thing. So, but I think that, you know, we really have to think about the ways in which we are thinking about the humanity in somebody and what their own experience might be, so that we can partner with them and think about how to build and move forward. I think there's probably more I could say on that, but I'm gonna turn it to Demar, and maybe we can come back to that question.
Yeah, and I'm going to say something which is slightly different. And I think what I'm about to say, I think some of it depends on where you are, or where you might find yourself within a higher ed institution. So I'm a student, you know, Nkemjika is a student as well. So for Nkemjika and I, our job is to agitate. Our job is to keep track of what's happening and to open lines of communication with administrators, with staff, with the people who are responsible for our educational experience, and making sure that we're helping hold them accountable, and they're also holding themselves accountable to the promises that they made to us when we enlisted as students, right? Because that is our job, right? And I think there are spaces where, you know, that's welcome, and that, you know, there are already open lines of communication around certain issues, but not around others, right? You know, a good example of that, you know, my colleagues at Harvard recently have a temporary contract that they established to form a graduate student union. That came from agitation. That came from conversations. It came from, you know, a lot of hard fought time and energy, where students were reaching out to administrators to say, hey, look, we need to be protected, because we're not just workers, we're also your employees, right? We are doing the labor of this institution. And that is their job, our job as students, to remind universities sometimes. And then to think from a slightly different perspective, you know, if you find yourself, if you might find yourself as a staff or an administrator, somebody who's a part of a different office or center, I would encourage you to leverage the resources that you have, so that, you know, students can have the space to do what Brighid was talking about, is like imagination work, or to have the resources to support them in launching different campaigns, right? I would not be here were it for my mentors when I've been at different education institutions who've given me space to do that kind of work, or who've supported me and other students as we've gone about that work. And, you know, even as faculty, you know, you might find yourself as an instructor, or, you know, again, as a professor. And, you know, I think there's positionality there that can be leveraged, resources there that can be leveraged. And so I'm saying all this to say that you could work your way all the way up the institutional ladder. There's something everybody can do. But I think it really, again, for me, it goes back to, what is an institution willing to commit itself to? You know, what is the university leadership willing to commit itself to? Because change can happen one of many ways. It can happen top down and bottom up. It works out different ways. It shakes out different ways depending on the approach, right? But I think also in terms of creating open avenues for participation, that's critical. And so, you know, to speak very briefly, so we can get to the question, when I was a master's student at Michigan, I got a chance to be a part of our institution's university-wide diversity, equity, inclusion planning process. You know, not just supporting a research center that was kind of the thought partner behind that transformation, but also serving on a committee that was responsible for coming up with a strategic plan for my school of public policy, right? And so, again, you might find yourself in a position where you're on a committee. Maybe you just got tapped into a committee recently, right? Or maybe your institution's thinking about creating committees. The question I would have is, do you have student voices there? Are they symbolic voices? Or are you giving them a stake in helping to create a solution to the problem, right? Because ultimately, you know, this comes down to, if we want to shift politics and power dynamics, we have to get as many stakeholders to the table as can sit at the table. And that sometimes happens, but it doesn't happen often enough. But again, if we want to, you know, avoid insanity, we have to be willing to try different things. And so those are some ways I would encourage you and others in higher ed and education institutions in general to think about pursuing that.
Thank you.
Just a tiny bit more about this, and then I'm also going to answer, if it's okay, Nkemjika, the question about language and about terminology into the response. And then please, I'd love to hear your perspective and any other questions that you'd like to jump in on. The other thing I just wanted to add to this is just specifically highlighting courage, and that change comes from courage, and courage looks really different. I think, Demar hit the nail on the head, that it can look really different if you're a student, if you're on a committee member, if you're tenured, if you're not tenured, if you're a staff person, if you're a term employee, right? We all have different levels of vulnerability in our institution, and our identities, of course. Like, our identities also might make us feel more or less safe to be able to engage in particular conversations. I think this is a particular time where people are saying, I'm gonna take some steps to be a little bit more courageous. I think that's both individually and institutions, because institutions are coming out saying things I never thought that they would say, or actions that I never thought would happen. And so I think that piece about courage is really, really important. And so, yes, for students as agitators, y'all might be able to, like, this is our job, this is what we're here to do, we're gonna go for it. But maybe it is on your committee or in your role, it is just having the courage to ask, to say, can we practice, using this particular terminology? Can we practice saying Black and not just saying, people of color or minority, right? And I think that this is where it's really important to say what you mean. So all too often, I feel like I'm in conversations where people are like, oh, well, we're talking, like I said earlier, we're talking about the issues. What issues? Well, we're talking about the issues of people. What people are we talking about? We're talking about the minorities. Well, who's a minority? Are we talking about the women that are in engineering? Are we talking about the men that are in nursing? Are we talking about, Black people in across campus? Like, what are we talking about? And so again, it's hard to have that conversation if there's not the courage to answer and to talk about to name who we're talking about. So I think that as far as the language piece, it's as much as you can be specific, it's really important. Different people on this call are gonna have different opinions about language. I try to say, if I'm talking about Asian Americans, I try to say Asian Americans. And that is also different from Asians, because Asians might not be born in the United States, right? So I try to be very, very specific. It might be very different than Pacific Islander. So when I'm talking about a particular group, I try to be very specific and clear about what I'm talking about. Black and African American can also be really different. Black can be, people who are from Jamaica, or people who are from Nigeria. It can be people who are from the United States, from Detroit, or from, Louisiana. It can be anybody. But African American is specifically people who are born in the United States, right? So, or have a citizenship. And so I think that there are particular ways that we need to use language very specifically to be able to say what we mean. As far as the term, particularly around Black and brown, I've also heard a lot of people use this very differently. Some people I know, when they're using Black and brown, they're like, oh, well, I'm like referring to Black people and Latinx people and indigenous people. Other people I know are like, well, no, Black and brown also includes Asians. So I think that for me, that term is very trendy right now, but for me, it's not as descriptive, because I think that people who are using it might have a very clear sense of who they're talking about. The people who are receiving it might not know they're included in the group that you're talking about. So for me, that's a term that I personally have chosen not to use very frequently. But again, people might have very different opinions on how they utilize that term. BIPOC is a new one that's come up more recently. I think it initially dated back about 5 years, but I think particularly in the last few months, last year, it's come up a lot more. And so really the BIPOC is a term that's really come up to highlight and be more specific in naming Black, Indigenous, and then people of color, right? So it's trying to do more of that specific naming. There are mixed opinions. Some people love the term, some people do not like the term. It's like most things. People have their own personal opinions about how they want to be referred to. So for me, again, the choice that I choose to make is as specific as much as I can. I try to be as specific as I can. The last term that I want to respond to, and then I'll throw it over to either of you who want to respond next, is the word minority. That one I don't use either. I try to use minoritized. Minority is I think about my math class and the equation where you have the alligator is eating the numbers, right? So that's really about, there's a majority group and there's a minority group. So that's numerical to me. But this was popular a number of years ago to talk about the majority, minority, and things like that. That's a misnomer. If we're talking about minority, we're talking about a population that has a smaller number in a particular group. So in the United States, it would be Black, Asian American, Indigenous people, right? It'd be a variety of different groups. But to use the word minoritized really talks about the action that has been done upon people of color primarily to make them feel less than. So that is a term that I choose to use. I also know that there's lots of ways in the word minority has been folded into lots of things. There's lots of groups that talk about URMs, underrepresented minorities, and there's programs that are centered around that, right? So I get that this is a bigger issue, right? But I also think, like, I encourage you to really say what you mean wherever you can. So if those are the conversations, if you're involved in a program that is centered around, increasing URMs in STEM, maybe that's where your courage comes in, and you want to think about how you can have a specific conversation within your unit or your committee about how that term can be changed to think about how you're specifically targeting the group that you want to address. So I'll pause there.
Yeah, just to go back to the higher education question, I think one thing that both faculty and especially administrators alike, just coming from someone who is leading a committee on diversity and inclusion, who has worked in Office of Multicultural Affairs in my high school, who has been in a multitude of these meetings now in the past couple of weeks, is listen to your students when they say it the first time, because a lot of the things, besides, I think, defund the police or dismantling the police, I think most of the things I'm hearing right now are things that I've said in high school, I've said, years prior, who, alumni of both my high school and my college have said years prior. These things are not new, just no one's listening and no one's taking them as seriously until it gets to be an inconvenient problem. So essentially, you're not listening to students until it becomes inconvenient. Until then, like, what you have, the current systems you have in place, the current infrastructure you have in place to support your students, whether or not it's really supporting them, as long as it's convenient for that institution, it'll stay. So I think really when it comes to higher education, especially, for schools who, you want, Demar, you attend Yale, and then Brighid, you work at Princeton, like, these are very high institutions. They're known as like the leading institutions of not only this nation, but the world. So when you take steps to like finally diversify your staff, to finally make your students feel safe on campus, both in the classroom and in their residential lives, so on and so forth, the world is watching. So I think that's just something to keep in mind. I will move on because we're running out of time for the Q&A. I will move on to one last question, and then I see we have a couple other questions. So if those people want to stay later on for like the open dialogue we're going to have, because I think those are both really good questions, but I'm just going to go to the one that was asked first, from Albert Mitugo. He says, great to see all across folks of white descent being our allies in the space, but how do we have them move from just being allies to co-conspirators?
That's, well, I think to some extent that matters who you are. Like, who are you in relation to the people who you are trying to motivate or animate? Or who are you in relation to the people who you're trying to build community with, right? Because I think that ultimately will change the strategy of how you might get people to the table to talk as a conversation, right? So, if I was colleagues with someone, but if I didn't have a personal relationship, it might be harder for me to pull that person in from a personal vantage point, right? But as a colleague, there might be creative ways that I can pull them in. Likewise, if you're talking about, people who you might manage or people who are part of your family, it's a different dynamic. I think there's also a way which, and ultimately too, it's not going to be, there's no silver bullet that's going to just suddenly one day help people absolve themselves of their ignorance, right? There's a way in which there are certain things which can be initially brought to people's attention that they then have to choose to actively pursue themselves, right? So there's a collective nature of how this work has to happen, but there's also individual commitments that people have to be willing to make. And I think there's a way, actually, Nkemjika, that I can touch on the question that followed this. So even in the example of sports, let's say, so if you find yourself as a coach of a team or working with different athletes, maybe maybe you don't have unlimited resources to do everything you would want to do, like on your specific budget. But what are the things that you can do, right? You can create space on your team to have different conversations, about things that are affecting the present, be they lynchings that are happening in the United States, be it other forms of racial violence that's taking place. So leaving open spaces for dialogue, right? And likewise, as somebody who's a coach, you're responsible not just for the player, as an athlete, but also as a person, as a future leader, as a future member of society, because you never know what that person's going to go off and do. And so, how can you call people from across your networks to help support different athletes with participating in different, leadership institutes or trainings institutes, or they say, you know what, in the off season, I want to spend time, working about this or learning about that, or, I want to go travel to a place where I can train, but I can also understand more about the history of that country because it's really relevant to things that I care about right now, right? And so I think that there's, again, there's different ways that people can utilize the resources they have access to or the connections that they have, to support whoever it is that they're trying to motivate. And I also want to say something that, hopefully doesn't fall on, too much of a sour note. But I think there's some people who aren't going to make it. What I mean by that is there's some people, despite your best efforts, despite all that you might do to help keep them informed or to help them, recognize what they're doing is harmful, or is that, that they have the capacity to change. Some people might not change, right? There are institutions in this country that don't want to change, right? Which is why, if it's the KKK or if it's a private citizen, we have people who think it's okay to go out and lynch Black people, to lynch anybody for that matter. We have people who think it's okay to go and destroy immigrant communities in this country, or think it's okay to kill trans people on the street, right? We can't forget, like, all these things are happening simultaneously, right? And so, there are a lot of people, I think, that you can pull that can and might be willing to, engage in dialogue or change their behavior, but not everybody's going to make it. And historically, that's also true too. But I also think there's enough people who are going to make it or who can make it if given the opportunity, right? And if we all collectively play a part in this process of change, I don't see why, we couldn't, see, fundamental transformation happen in a lot of different ways. But again, it's not going to come, it's not going to happen tomorrow, right? It would be great if it could happen that way. But these practices have to be sustained forever, not just tomorrow, not just a year. From my perspective, if it's taken, 400 years to create the collective harms that we're trying to navigate right now today, collectively, and the traumas associated with those, we have to spend at least 400 years of trauma-free effort to be able to even begin to undo those harms, let alone undo the things that have been produced and are actively being produced today. And so, so I think it is important to ultimately build community, but realize that some people aren't going to want to participate in that, unfortunately.
Yeah, I think I would just add briefly, and I recognize we're right up on time, so I'll keep my comment brief, that I think that's a really tough one for me, because I even push back on the term ally a bit, while I also run the Ally Project at my institution. So I think that ally is a term that we also have to be very thoughtful about how we're using. I think that a lot of times people have self-designated themselves as allies, where really I think it's the job of the minoritized community to designate who their allies are. So to own that label, I think it can be really challenging. And so I think that, this idea about moving from the ally to the co-conspirator is really the idea of, for those who aren't familiar with it, is really the idea of, like, how do I get down in the trenches? How do I see that your struggle, your trauma is intimately connected to mine? And how am I there with you in solidarity, not just kind of like at home, but like really there with you? And that can look different, right? Like it doesn't necessarily mean that you are in the protests and, on the streets and out, literally out in the streets, but how are you challenging conversations? How are you willing to ask that uncomfortable question? How are you willing to say that somebody has said something racist and have that conversation with them. I think that for me, that's really the idea about moving from ally to co-conspirator. So, you know, I think just within that the same spirit, just where are those opportunities for you all to do that, or to you know, have that conversation with someone else, to say, you know, what you said was troubling or problematic, and here's why. And I, you know, I do this as a friend and a colleague, and in support of our other colleagues or our students. I think that's where a lot of the challenge is.
Thank you both for your comments on that. And thank you both for coming and sharing your comments and thoughts on all of these questions. So that kind of just ends the official portion of this panel. I would invite anyone who wants to stay to continue discussing, asking questions, to please stay on. Just make sure that your cameras are on so we can see you, but if not, please feel free to leave. But now this will be an open time for discussion and more questions. So I'll just wait for people to clear out.